Good day, students. Welcome to another lecture on research methodology in history. Today, we will be learning about Roman historiography. Now, Roman historiography does not precisely coincide with the Roman state. According to Roman accounts, the city of Rome was founded by Romulus in 753 BCE. For the first 250 years of its existence, it was a kingdom, and from 509 BCE, it was a republic. But Roman history writing started almost 500 years later, the Roman use of an alphabetic script being 300 years after Greece. Roman historical writing and scholarship were heavily influenced by Greek culture, but Roman historiography is almost entirely in Latin, except for a specific group of historians known to history as the Graeco-Roman historians. It would be useful to discuss this exceptional group before embarking upon an analysis of mainstream Roman historiography. So, Graeco-Roman historiography. Rome expanded rapidly in the Mediterranean region between 220 BCE and 167 BCE, conquering the Seleucids, Carthage, Macedonia, and the Greek states. The conquest of the Greek states ensured the rapid spread and diffusion of Greek culture into the Roman world. In this context can be seen the rise of a new type of historiography where the language and style were Greek, but the themes were almost entirely Roman, focusing on Roman expansion or on those areas that the Romans had conquered. This type of history writing came to be known as Graeco-Roman historiography, and it was popular among both Greeks and Romans. We shall therefore discuss a few of the notable historians from this group. First is Timaeus. Timaeus was a Sicilian exile living in Athens who is notable for his use of written sources in his landmark book, Italian and Sicilian History. He was able to use the Athenian library, and thus his work was a major deviation from the existing Greek tradition based on Thucydides and Xenophon that relied on first-hand eyewitness testimony and oral sources. His method was so new and so different from the existing histories that he actually drew criticism from other historians. His use of written sources proved to be a path-breaking methodological innovation, and it is to his credit that he did not remain content with just this one achievement, but that he also used critical reading practices on his sources, carefully screening them before use. He even used epigraphic, that is, inscriptional sources. Next is Polybius. Polybius is generally regarded as the greatest of this group of historians. He was a Greek, but he was captured by the Romans and spent a lot of time in Rome as a hostage. There, he absorbed Roman culture and learning. And later in life, he essentially became an intermediary between Greece and Rome. Between 264 BCE and 146 BCE, he wrote his famous histories in 40 volumes. In this massive work, he wrote about the rise to power of Rome, and Polybius considered his work to be a universal history, and in his opinion, such a work was only possible at that time because of Rome's essential unification of the Mediterranean. While he considered himself to be similar to the Greek historians like Thucydides and Ephorus, he argued that their work could not be considered to be universal history due to the political dispersal of the past compared to Rome's dominance during this time. One of Polybius's primary tasks was to explain the political and military might of Rome. He argued that the harmonious blending of the three forms of government, the republican, the aristocratic, and the monarchical, was the key, and added to this was the favor of fortune. However, he also argued that fortune alone had not enabled Rome to succeed. their political and military conduct and experiences during the Punic Wars with Carthage had been absolutely essential. For Polybius, history had a didactic purpose. Firstly, it taught leaders methods of leadership by imparting useful knowledge, and secondly, it taught the people about the vagaries of fortune and how to adapt to changes, either beneficial or catastrophic. Methodologically, Polybius was directly opposed to Timaeus, as he repeatedly emphasized the need for direct inquiry, first-hand experience, and travel. He argued that a knowledge of geography and topography was vital for a historian. To him, direct inquiry and experience were always superior to investigation through written sources. He had his own theory of causation, arguing that apparent causes needed to be contrasted with long-term underlying causes rooted in geographical and institutional history. He even had his own independent dating system based on the dates of the Olympic Games. Next is Dionysius of Halicarnassus. Dionysius was a firm believer in the didactic purpose of history, and thus he argued that history is, as his quotation, philosophy teaching by example. He was a believer and supporter of Roman supremacy, and argued that Rome had far surpassed all other civilizations. His massive history, Roman Antiquities, was based on the works of Roman antiquarians and annalists. And finally, Plutarch. Plutarch is especially notable for his achievements in biographical history. He wrote 46 biographies in his parallel lives and tried to interpret history through them. He started with mythical figures like the founders of Athens or Rome and continued writing till the contemporary period, finishing with Antony and Cleopatra. Plutarch diverged from Polybius, mostly preferring written sources, including those written by the subjects of his biographies, like the writings of Pericles and Sulla. One of his main purposes was to teach political and ethical lessons from the lives of his subjects. Now we come to mainstream Roman historiography. If we look at how history writing was developing in Rome itself, that is the history written by Romans, the first item that is of special interest is the practice of writing annals and lists of magistrates, both of which exist since the 4th century BCE. The Annales Maximi were annals about important events of ancient Rome recorded by the state priests. However, scholars are of the opinion that it was a long drawn-out struggle with Carthage, known in history as the Punic Wars, that truly stimulated Roman historiography. At the time of the famous Roman defeat to Carthage at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, Quintus Fabius Pictor, who is sometimes referred to as the first Roman historian, started writing a history of Rome. Even though this book was in Greek, it focused entirely on Rome from its establishment to the Punic Wars. While earlier sections were compiled from memories, stories, and records, the part focusing on the Punic Wars was a highly coherent, comprehensive narrative. The major break with the annalistic tradition, as well as the first major Roman history written in Latin, came from Marcus Porcius Cato, who was also a Roman leader, official, and scholar of some renown. One of his goals was to ensure that Roman history was written in Latin. Having discarded the previous annalistic tradition, he greatly expanded the scope of his history by taking into account geography, topography, myth, legend, folk tales, and genealogies. His history was not chronologically arranged like the annals, but rather it was set in a thematic design. Cato was thus a pioneer and landmark historian, forever dividing Roman historiography into annals and history, which came to be seen as res gestae. Cato was succeeded by Marcus Tullius Cicero, who put forward a theory of history. Cicero's ideas regarding history have been discussed, repeated, and analyzed for centuries. He emphasized the morally useful role of history, but he qualified the idea of a truthful history. While he agreed that history should be truthful, he argued that since it also had the responsibility of teaching future generations, it needed to be persuasive. Hence, he argued, history needed to be related to rhetoric. History writing could not simply eschew the aesthetic aspects of writing, but taking cues from rhetoric and literary traditions and culture, it had to be attractive as well. With the establishment of a Latin-Roman historiography, we now need to look at the three greatest Roman historians, Sallust, Livy, and Tacitus. All of them talked heavily about historical change, the causes for changes, as well as how Rome was changing. We come first to Sallust. Gaius Sallustius Crispus, or Sallust as he was known then, was one of the most famous Roman historians of the Republican period. His primary work, Histories, focused on the period between 78 BCE and 67 BCE, but unfortunately, it has been lost. Historians have only succeeded in recovering two monographs. One of these is Catiline's Conspiracy, or The War with Catiline, which discusses the unsuccessful revolt of Sergius Catilina in 63 BCE against Rome. This revolt was defeated and Catilina was killed. The other monograph is known as the Jugurthine War. This focused on the Roman war with King Jugurtha of Numidia between 111 BCE and 105 BCE. Jugurtha had been a principal ally of Rome against Carthage in the last Punic War. Sallust argues in these monographs that Rome in the late Republican period was in a state of decline. By this, he did not mean military decline, as Roman military power remained extremely strong, but rather moral and political decline. He argued that the Republic had been deeply corrupted after its victories against Carthage and conquests across the Mediterranean region. He favorably upheld the ancient republic as a paragon of morality and virtue, as an exemplar to be followed. In contrast, the contemporary republic had gained too much power and wealth too fast, leading to corruption. Also, leaders like Sulla had established dictatorial rule, undermining Roman traditions of mixed government. Ambition, greed, and lust on one hand, and laziness, arrogance, and love of luxury on the other had hopelessly corrupted the Roman aristocracy. Thus, any virtuous leader would have to emerge from the non-aristocratic classes. Sallust demonstrated his arguments through descriptions of battles, speeches given by important characters which were mostly imaginary, and discussions on moral values. He argued that when humanity was guided by the mind, that is, by intellectual faculties, rather than by brute power and the desires of the body, virtuous rule could be achieved. This brings us to Livy. Titus Livius is famous in history as Livy. He fashioned his own historical style, trying to find a middle path between the old annalistic tradition and the continuous narrative favored by the Greek historians. His great work is known as From the Foundation of the City, and it was a history of Rome from its foundation to the contemporary period, which for Livy was the reign of Augustus. This massive book consisted of 142 volumes, of which only 35 have survived. Livy's history, like the works of Polybius, was hailed as a universal history, and for a long time it was regarded as the standard history of the Roman Republic. Many have criticized Livy for allegedly copying indiscriminately from other sources for his history. There is evidence that he practiced some form of source criticism. He occasionally criticizes or praises his sources, and sometimes he looked for new sources to better complete his massive project. Even though Livy's history was acclaimed as a universal history like that of Polybius, he did disagree with the other historian over a number of issues. While Polybius attributed Rome's rise and success to the form of government, Livy gave the credit to the qualities of the people. According to him, the Romans of the early republic were morally upright, frugal, disciplined, brave, and self-restrained. These qualities made them able rulers, generals, and soldiers, and thus they had been able to establish a great state like Rome. But with the influx of wealth and the growth of power and luxury, Rome was afflicted with moral corruption and thus fell into decline. Thus, in this theme, Livy agreed strongly with Sallust. Livy, in fact, not only emphasized this theory of moral decline, but he argued that history should serve as a vehicle by which the morals of the past are held up to the people of the present and thus serve as a corrective teaching force. And now we come to Tacitus. Publius Cornelius Tacitus was a Roman senator and historian. His historical works trace the history of the period between 14 CE to 96 CE. That is from the death of Augustus, first emperor of Rome, to the death of the emperor Domitian. Thus, of our three historians, he was the only one writing about imperial rather than republican history. The two principal works of Tacitus are Annals and Histories. His later works were fiercely critical of the corruption and autocratic rule of the emperors. He argued that most of the virtues of the older Roman periods had been lost, and that Roman corruption had reached proportions beyond the scope of any corrective reform. While his historical works discussed good and evil through examples, he did not confine himself only to this sort of discussion, but rather he was outspoken in his criticism of the cruelty and corruption of the people and rulers. It was his hope that future generations would be outraged from these descriptions and therefore try to create a better society and state. Some scholars have argued that in service to this goal, Tacitus even distorted his historical descriptions to exaggerate the extent of the corruption. With the rise of Christianity in Europe, Tacitus was broadly neglected, as he was sharply critical of the Christian religion, considering it to be a source of evil and superstition. However, with the rise of the Renaissance in Europe, his critical attitude to religion made him interesting to scholars. What set him apart from other historians like Livy was his mode of writing. While Livy employed rhetoric and wrote a history that could be used for public oration, Tacitus wrote in a terse, reserved prose that was better for private reading. His restrained prose and his general, non-partisan style therefore endeared him to many early modern historians who prized neutrality in history. Moreover, Tacitus has written a variety of works, from biographies like Agricola to the histories, which followed the annalistic mode of history writing. Now we will take a look at the features of Roman historiography. Since we have discussed some of the principal Roman historians, it would be useful and instructive to briefly evaluate the broad features. Morality and its decline was a major concern of most Roman historians. There was a sense of foreboding in many writings about the present and future declining sharply from the exemplary, virtuous past. Thus, history itself became a vehicle of morality and moral teachings, which conveyed examples of good and virtuous conduct and even evil and corruption through examples to better enable the present political class to avoid evil and choose the path of good. Unlike the Greeks who wrote for the future, the Romans wrote with the goal of influencing the present. Strongly connected with this tradition of moral teaching was the use of rhetorical styles in writing. Moral teaching in history is useless unless it is attractive and persuasive to the reader. And hence, historians like Cicero and Quintilian used rhetorical styles in their writing. History was written by the educated, leisurely class who, while critical of the aristocracy, were also contemptuous about lower classes and therefore the great masses of the common people. History was therefore about grand events like battles and grand personalities like generals and political leaders. The everyday life of the common people found no place there. Roman history writing remained predominantly annalistic. While there were historians like Cato who avoided this style, it was still the preferred form for most historians. Now we will take a look at Jewish and Christian historiography. While we have discussed most of the famous Roman historians, it is important to discuss Jewish and Christian historiography during this time. The Jewish people had a very old literary tradition, and Christian historiography is vital for tracing the rise of Christianity within the empire and the distinctive cultural influence they had on Roman intellectual thought. So firstly, Jewish historiography. Jewish historiography can be traced to very ancient times, with there being significant amounts of history and historical consciousness in the Hebrew Bible. Greek-educated Jews produced some remarkable histories of the ancient period. From 323 BCE to 135 CE, Jewish historians produced a range of scholarship, large parts of which have unfortunately been lost. They were interested in establishing the antiquity of the tradition. Thus, historians like Demetrius wrote a biblical chronology starting with Adam, and later Eupolemus extended this chronology to contemporary times. Of all the Jewish historians, the most notable was Josephus. His books, The Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities, tried to combine historical scholarship with religious ideas. The first book, about the Jewish revolt against Rome and the ensuing destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 CE. And here, Josephus tried to explain that these events were made possible due to the impiety and disunity among Jews. Aside from this, in his other book, he tried to trace the history of the Jewish people from creation to prove that the civilization was older than Greek or Roman civilization. Now we come to Christian historiography. Christian historiography was broadly combative and polemical. While basing itself of Jewish, Greek, and Roman scholarship, it tried to establish itself as a distinct historical tradition. The first historian to be noted here is Sextus Julius Afranius. Afranius was the first notable historian of this tradition, and he wrote a history of the world from the time of creation to 221 CE. The history of the cultures and people was framed in a broadly Christian framework. It set the pattern for many subsequent Christian histories. It fixed the time of creation as 5500 BCE and even tried to estimate a time when the world would end. The next historian is Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius wrote the history of Christianity from the time of the conversion of the Emperor Constantine to his own period, that is 315 CE, in his two notable books, Chronicles and Ecclesiastical History. His principal theme was the rise and development of Christianity, the notable acts of holy figures like the apostles and other religious leaders, as well as the heresies and errors of those who had disagreed with the Christian tradition. His history is particularly notable for differentiating between the sacred ecclesiastical history which he had written and the usual profane political history about kings, politics, and battles. This sacred profane divide was a new methodological intervention that made Christian historiography stand out from preceding traditions. And finally, we come to St. Augustine of Hippo. Augustine was an instrumental and revered figure in the development of Christianity and Christian theology. One of his most important ideas was the idea of the two cities, the heavenly city or city of God and the worldly city. He also located these two cities in history, with Jerusalem being the heavenly city and Babylon being the worldly city. Augustine argued for a finite linear history informed by his Christian worldview. He divided this history into different parts. Part 1, from Adam to the flood. Part 2, from the flood to Abraham. Part 3, from Abraham to David. Part 4, from David to the Babylonian captivity. Part 5, from the Babylonian captivity to Christ. Part 6, from the crucifixion to the second coming, which would lead to the seventh age or the millennium, after which the world would be destroyed and the eternal age would begin. This concept of a finite historical timeline was Augustine's chief contribution to historiography. And now finally, we come to our conclusion. Thus, Roman historiography encompasses a huge period of time from the early Republic to the late parts of the Empire. Originally in Greek, it came to be written mainly in Latin. It was primarily focused on conveying moral lessons through the narration of political events. In the later parts of the Empire, Christian thoughts and ideas deeply influenced historical scholarship. Thank you.